Tuesday, July 14th. How's everyone doing out there? Welcome to another edition of Cape Ann Today. Heather and I are going to share, once again, two more fun interviews with you. The first is with Erika Brown. She's the editor and publisher of the Manchester Cricket, and she's going to talk about, amongst some other things, their big move to a new office downtown.
Hey, Corey. I'm sorry that Heather's not joining us today, but it's great to have you.
Well, thank you. It's great to see you again in a new space.
Exactly. I know. Look at my glamorous life.
You know how many letters we're going to get about the missing whiteboard?
Does anybody really look at my whiteboard when we're talking?
People like to wander, you know.
I always used to make fun of anybody who loved working with a whiteboard, because I always used to say to them, "Isn't the English language enough? Do you really need to draw me a picture?"
Yeah.
So it's ironic that you remember the whiteboard that was always in the background. But yeah, we moved last week on Thursday. It's actually happened on Wednesday. I scheduled Affordable Movers in Gloucester. Bill Fulford came. Literally, we're putting the paper, last week's edition, to bed, and I'm sending it to the printer. And as I was pressing send, he and his crew were coming in to the space to break down and move everything out. It was really, I wanted to do that. I did it by design, because if anything went wrong, I wanted the maximum amount of time before, I needed to put out the next edition of the paper. Mm-hmm. It went smoothly for the most part. And then the new internet guys. So we are now downtown at 11 Rear Beach Street. So we're right in the middle of the thick of downtown, but it's in a building that's kind of set back, and it's in an old yoga studio. So I hope it has good vibes.
Mm-hmm. Namaste.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Mofo.
Yeah.
So this is it, and we're all together. Where there's a lot more space now, and it's going to be a really lovely place. I'm really thinking about it, though, more for post-COVID. When we're on the other side of COVID, what I'd really love for the space is for people to be able to come and go, come in. We can talk to people who are running for office. We can talk, have community meetings and community events, maybe even a wine hour or two.
Or three, yeah. So Erika, let's talk about, there are some signature Manchester events that are sort of being toggled about with right now, including Festival by the Sea.
I think those are, yes, you're exactly right. And Festival by the Sea is very timely. I don't know how many years Festival by the Sea has been going on. I'm going to say maybe 6 years. It's the Cape Ann Chamber of Commerce. It's their brainchild. And it's essentially a way to get artisans to come in. It's a sidewalk type festival. It brings a lot of people to the town to discover the town, to enjoy the retailers and enjoy our great restaurants and beautiful setting of Manchester. And so, the big thing was, would it happen this year? And pretty much up until about a month ago, the answer was probably no. And Ken Reel from the Cape Ann Chamber of Commerce said, no, let's try to do it. He and Mike Storella, who's a board member and really connected to the art community. He's got a studio in Essex. But in any case, they started talking about it, and then they had a design. First of all, they probed interest from the artisans. They got 60 people saying they wanted to come and get tables. So they worked with that 60 number, and what's going to happen if it works out, and I think it is going to work out, is they'll have a table, they'll have a big tent out on Masconomo Park, which is really open. There's parking right there. And they'll have sort of appropriately spaced, sort of table setups. And they're going to try to do it in the last weekend of August. And the reason why that's a good weekend is the rescheduled red, white, and blue breakfast. I don't know if you've ever been to that. That's a true Manchester tradition that takes place usually the Saturday before 4th of July. That's being relocated to that weekend. So the idea is we'll have this sort of rhythm for the last weekend of the year, looking at Labor Day and having it. They floated it to the Board of Selectmen after a lot of sort of conversations, some back channel conversations, to make sure that they had addressed the issues that were, that really needed to be addressed. And it went really, really well. The Board of Selectmen were really positive about the idea. They said, let's talk. They didn't approve it, but they said, let's come back and let's work through the issues, and we'll give you, our answer in pretty short time. And what was funny is they got that positive reception directly last Monday night, directly after a pretty long, I want to say it's like maybe an hour and a half discussion that got a little, I'm not going to say heated, but almost heated, about the whole issue of opening up downtown and reopening it, and the issues with parking and the issues with retail and and crowds and things like that. So I took that as a really positive sign.
Interesting. The other event we're talking about is maybe bringing back the fishing tournament.
I know that's actually a real comer for Manchester. That was started. I hope I don't get this wrong, but it was started, I believe, by Scott Fabian and a couple of his friends 25 years ago, say. And it was a striped bass fishing tournament, and then it was, of course, they had a bluefish category and other categories. But anyway, so they did it, and they kind of petered out after having a real strong kind of following about 8 years ago. And it was a real local event, and it was a real family event. They had a kids division, and they had all sorts of stuff. It was really, people really loved it. And a local resident, Nate Berkowitz, who his father-in-law was also connected with the starting and running of it, and his mother-in-law is Michelle Bear. I don't know if you know who she is. She's well known around here, especially for the American Legion Auxiliary. She pretty much runs that. She would always design the t-shirts, so they were also really well. Nate has brought it back. He wrote in last week to say we want to bring it back and that's also going to be in August, and it's going to be sort of a smaller thing. I think fishing is one of those things with COVID that you can really do. It's kind of like golf and tennis, and there's certain things that lend themselves to social distancing. Getting out on the water, as you know, is one of them. So that looks like it's going to happen too, which is fantastic. I hope it happens.
It's amazing how many people I've seen fishing. Well, not only is the boat traffic crazy, but people fishing off of the rocks or on the ponds around here too. Lots of families, like it, a lot. Sometimes you would just drive by and see a father and son or something here. This is like the whole family all over the place all the time. It's been pretty cool. So let's hope that takes off again. And lastly, there's a really cool story here too about the Cadet Nurse Corps bill.
Yeah, that actually started last September in Manchester. Bruce Tarr came and gave a citation, which he does, to Shirley Wilkinson, 91 years old. She's the mother of Sue Parker, who is the president of the Manchester Historical Museum here. So it's, and the Nurse Corps Cadet program, or Corps, the Cadet Nurse Corps, that's what it was called. In World War II, it was a way of training young women, often very young. Shirley was 17 and on Singing Beach when she decided to do this. And it was a way of training nurses to make up for all the flight of nurses who had gone to, towards the war effort. So it was essentially a war effort, but it was a supplemental war effort. So she was part of this program. And at the time, he said that he was going to sponsor a bill in the Senate to declare a day to honor the Nurse Corps women in Massachusetts. And last week, that actually got signed as a bill by Governor Baker. And July 1st will now be it's called U.S. Cadet Nurse Corps Day in Massachusetts. And one thing that's kind of interesting, Corey, it's the only service that has yet to be declared officially as a veteran, a category for veterans. Which is interesting. Yeah,
very cool. And then after this, Erika, surprise, surprise, but Senator Bruce Tarr actually is going to speak on this particular subject right after you today.
Well, there you go. You can ask about Shirley Wilkinson. I've got a great picture of, she was flirting with him the whole time. It was really awesome. He loved it.
Of course. Well, thanks for this. We'll check back with you later this week, and congratulations on the move.
Oh, thanks. I'll talk to you on Thursday, and it was great to talk to you, Corey, as always.
So I used to like reading Erika's whiteboard behind her and see like who she had lined up that day.
Yeah, I mean, we all missed that too, and I was actually trying to get her to roll it back just once I get set up again. It's like, yeah. So we'll see. And it's good to know Festival by the Sea is a real nice event. We covered that for Now We're Here last year. So hopefully they can bring that back safely for everybody. Our second interview today is with Senator Bruce Tarr. He speaks about what Eric was just talking about with this Nurse Corps bill. You spoke with him, Heather.
Yes, he actually talked about the Nursing Cadet Corps bill last week. Mm-hmm. So this week, he had just come. We spoke to him on Friday evening. He had just come from 2 super emotional days in the Senate working on the police reform legislation. And that would change the way officers and civilians interact, especially regarding the use of force. If passed, that bill would, among many other things, ban chokeholds and the use of tear gas on protesters. So to be clear, in advance of this interview, people want this legislation to pass, but there had been a strange miscommunication around the issue of qualified immunity that ignited like people all across the state. So this bill has been tabled 2 times in an unprecedented way. And Tarr opens up by explaining this issue of qualified immunity.
So Heather, it's good to be with you and to talk about what has been a very busy week in the Massachusetts State Senate. And these are going to be busy weeks running from now till the end of July, because right now under the rules, our legislative session ends, our formal session, on July 31st. Now we know that this year that isn't going to absolutely be the case, because we are going to have to come back after July 31st into a formal session to do a state budget. And as we've talked about before, we're really waiting for a couple of things for that. One is to see what the federal government's going to do to be able to help the states and the cities and towns. And we expect that won't happen before July 20th. And then we've also delayed the tax deadline. And so for people who are watching, a reminder that the federal and state tax income tax filing deadline got shifted to July 15th, and it has not been further extended. And so that's something that people need to be aware of. Now, you can still file an extension in the normal course of business the way that you would have before the pandemic, but for everyone, the deadline is July 15th, so something to keep in mind. But for the Senate, we have been immersed in some very, very intense legislation that relates to reforming police departments and more police oversight and accountability, and also trying to ensure that there is no racism in the way that policing is accomplished in Massachusetts. And I always need to say that we owe a huge debt of gratitude to the men and women who every day in our police departments go out and protect our neighborhoods and our safety and our rights. And we should never forget that they do a tremendous job, and that job requires them to make a lot of sacrifice, and a lot of that sacrifice is also shared by their families. And so when we talk about this subject and this legislation, I think we always have to remember that the people we're talking about are very dedicated professionals. Now, that being said, there is a bill before the Senate to be able to look at a whole host of issues. And on many of those issues, there is actually widespread agreement. So for instance, the idea of banning chokeholds, and the idea of having a police officer standards and training process so that every police officer is certified for a 3-year period in the same way that other professionals are certified, like dentists and lawyers and doctors and just a whole host of people. And those things are again, the subject of fairly widespread agreement about moving forward. But there are other subjects that are more controversial, and one of them is a subject called qualified immunity. And it is causing a lot of concern on Beacon Hill and well beyond Beacon Hill, because it deals with a very limited amount of immunity for police officers when they're acting in an area of law that may be unclear. And so it's important to stress that if you're violating a law, a statute, that does not allow you to have the defense of qualified immunity. Qualified immunity is intended to address a situation where it might not be a clear area of law. And if it's your understanding that you are acting under the law, then you can assert the defense of qualified immunity. And unfortunately, there have been some news accounts that would indicate that the Senate bill is seeking to eliminate qualified immunity completely. And naturally, you can understand that the men and women in our police departments would be deeply concerned about that, because it would remove a protection that they have for doing their job, even in the normal course of business. And so what's important to understand is the Senate bill does nothing of the kind. It actually seeks to modify qualified immunity and to change the standard by which it's available. And there is a very, very vigorous debate about what the new standard the Senate has proposed would mean. But I just need to clear the air in a way and say that the Senate is not proposing the elimination of qualified immunity.
Well, Senator, could you go this bill is intended to improve the way police respond to the community. Is that right?
It is. And there's actually a lot of language in it, Heather, about trying to use de-escalation techniques before doing other things. And I'm very proud to have been involved in the writing of that language.
So I understand this qualified immunity has become sort of the focal point, and there's a lot of emotion around that. But could you just touch on a couple of the other issues? For instance, I understand that part of the bill is structured so that it can take away some of the demands that have been made on the police force of late, like, responding to domestic issues and social issues and, user issues. And the police get so involved in places that maybe they're not so comfortable. And this bill is supposed to give them some relief from that, or structure their work, define them better.
Absolutely. And part of the title of the bill is the word shift. And the idea is to shift the paradigm. And I actually was very happy to work on a lot of the language that you're talking about with my colleagues, and particularly with Senator Comerford from Western Massachusetts. She's from the Amherst area. And the idea is not to say that we don't need a police response, but the idea is to say we need more, and that police shouldn't be the sole way we respond to issues of people that may be having issues with mental health or substance abuse or domestic issues. And I think it's important to understand we are always going to need the police to be available because we don't want anyone to get hurt. But it's also important to understand that the police are not experts in those subjects, even though they have training. So what we're trying to do is create a new standard in Massachusetts where there's the availability of a mental health crisis team or a social worker or somebody that's trained to be able to be brought into the situation so that the response is not solely a police response. And that's something that we've heard from the police, as well as many others, that it would be more effective to do that rather than to only have the one way of responding to these issues.
Right. So and there's, where was I going with that? So in general, there's a lot of really good in this bill, and a lot of people believe in it. I think the governor believes in it. There are certain organizations that represent people of color in Massachusetts who believe in it. So where is the emotionality coming from? Is it coming from the police and the police unions?
A lot of it is because of concern about the protections that I mentioned being removed from them. But this is a very emotional issue to begin with. We have had regularly groups of protesters and demonstrators out in front of the State House. We've seen what's happened all across the country and the state. So by its very nature, this is an extremely emotional issue. And this bill is causing that emotion to be focused on the Senate in particular. And, today in our legislative session, we once again put this bill on hold so that we can try to work through our differences. And I have to tell you, Heather, today was a very emotional day on the floor of the Senate, where we had remarks from senators that not only made a lot of us have our eyes well up with tears, but even some of the speakers. And so people should understand, A, how seriously this is being taken, and B, just the amount of impact it's having on elected officials who regularly deal with controversial issues. I think it points out the situation that we are in our country. And I think it points out that, in particular, the sensitivity around the issues that we're discussing. And, I have great faith in our legislative process. And my hope and expectation is that we'll find a way to work through this. But it has been particularly noteworthy for its degree of difficulty with regard to how sensitive, intense, and challenging it is to find consensus.
And where does this go next?
So we are, as we're speaking right now, I think your viewers would know, we are talking on Friday afternoon. We are going to return to session tomorrow morning at 10 a.m. in the Senate. That would be Saturday. I do not expect that we will see a lot of deliberation on the floor tomorrow, but what I do expect is that we'll see another full day of discussions with various stakeholders to try to get us to the point where we can have a debate on the floor about those 145 amendments.
And there's the House, they're working on their own legislation here, and then we're hoping this is resolved in 3 weeks, right?
Absolutely. So the House, like the Senate, has had a working group focused on this issue. We expect that they're going to release their bill most likely through the House Committee on Ways and Means next week, and that the House will also debate their bill. And then we predict that the bills will be sufficiently different that we'll need a conference committee, which is 3 members of the House and 3 members of the Senate, to sit down and try to reconcile those 2 different versions and to get a final bill to the governor's desk before the end of formal session on July 31st.
Well, I know you have to go pretty soon, so let's touch upon the other work you're doing this week.
So I'm really happy to talk about something that we've made reference to in the past, and that is being able to give restaurants a little bit more flexibility in being able to deliver mixed drinks with meals. And so the Senate today, and I'm going to read the bill number because I oftentimes forget bill numbers, but not substance. So we moved today on Senate 2740, which is an act to expand takeout and delivery options in response to COVID-19. And it's pretty much self-explanatory and straightforward. And it would just allow those mixed drinks and things other than wine and beer to be delivered with a meal by restaurants. And the restaurants have told us this is extremely, extremely important. And they've already lost a lot of revenue. We've talked about that a little bit in the past. A lot of people that work at restaurants have been laid off. We think that this measure will be very, very significant in helping them generate a little bit more revenue to keep going. So passed through the Senate today, moves to the House soon, and we hope that we'll be able to reach agreement on this one as well.
And you have some conversation about transportation.
Well, we do. And transportation it's one of those subjects, Heather, that we almost are constantly talking about in the legislature. But one of the things that we periodically have to do is pass a bond bill relative to our transportation infrastructure. And again, we've talked about this in the past, so I don't mean to be redundant, but a bond bill is different than a budget bill in that it authorizes borrowing. So it's the first step in a process, and then the administration has to choose which items to spend money on and which bonds to issue. So it's the first step, but this one happens to be in the neighborhood of about 16 to 17 billion with a B dollars. And generally these bills have a lifespan of 5 to 10 years, and it authorizes spending across a wide range of things. I mean, things that you would expect, like paving of roads and building of sidewalks and reconstruction of bridges. And the House has already passed its version of this bill. We're hoping to take this bill up next Thursday. And right now we are under an amendment deadline, and we have reached out to our communities and asked what they may be interested in having funded through this bill. It would be no surprise to you that we've gotten a robust response from communities on Cape Ann, and we're going to try to do the best we can to accommodate them. But it's always important, Heather, to not set an expectation that can't be met with regard to these things. So again, items that go into the bond bill are eligible to be funded, but are not necessarily funded. And that's an important distinction to make.
Mm. And there's 5 to 10 years to make those decisions, is that right? Yeah.
So generally, well, first of all, the reason that we use bond funds for these things is because it's for capital projects that generally speaking have a life of longer than 5 years. And second, we do this so that there can be a planning process. So we know that we'll have this much money available, and then we spend it gradually over that period of 5 to 10 years.
Can you just before you go, could you touch on the imperative of getting the budget passed and the issues that you are facing? Because I know it's really a grave issue right now, right?
It surely is. And it's one that is deeply concerning because whenever we consult with our panels of experts about this, they are predicting that we're going to have a $6 to $8 billion shortfall in the revenue that we need for the state budget. And by the way, we are now in the new fiscal year. We've talked in our past conversations about the approaching fiscal year. We're in it. And so we are now in state fiscal year 2021, which began on July 1st. And I think it's significant and maybe doesn't always get the attention it deserves, but we never for 1 minute contemplated a shutdown of state government in Massachusetts. We passed an interim budget so that we would have the resources to be able to keep moving forward at the spending levels from last year. So we haven't set new spending levels yet. And we also, in order to facilitate that, passed something called a RANS bill, which are borrowing notes in anticipation of receipt of additional revenue. And so we anticipated that we're going to get federal assistance and that we're going to get state tax revenue once we hit the new filing deadline on July 15th. So in anticipation of those things, we authorized borrowing to keep the state government going. And as we may have talked about before, we stand in very good shape as Massachusetts because we have such a large stabilization fund and we've had such significant fiscal discipline that our bonds in a very difficult marketplace are something that investors still want to buy. And so we're able to, with a combination of borrowing, some existing revenue, some cost saving measures, be able to continue moving forward. But we won't be able to do that for an entire fiscal year. At some point, we're going to need to have a budget. Now, there's a lot of discussion about how many months will that budget be for? And so I would say it wouldn't be unusual to expect that we may do some additional supplemental budgets. But at some point when we have a clearer picture of both the revenue and the cost side of the budget, we will have to convene in the House and the Senate and come up with a longer term budget. Difficult to predict right now when that might be, but it certainly won't be by the end of July.
Well, thank you so much for another really interesting conversation and for all the hard and difficult work in the last couple of days working on this police reform bill. I think it's so important and we thank you.
Well, thanks, Heather. It is difficult, but I'm honored to be able to do it and to represent the people of our area in these discussions. I consider it to be an extremely high honor to do that. And we'll continue to do the very best we can here and appreciate from hearing from people and appreciate being able to talk with you about these things from time to time.
And the same. So hopefully we see you next week.
We look forward to it. Thank you.
Take care. So the Senate had yet another legislative session on Saturday morning. Nothing got settled, and they are meeting again about this bill this morning. This is Monday when we're recording this. So hopefully by the time everyone sees it on Tuesday morning, there will be some action. The actual legislative session for this legislative session stops on July 31st. So everyone wants this bill to pass and they need to move quickly.
Well, I'm sure we'll follow up with Senator Tarr later on this week as well as we do each week for Cape Ann Today. We want to thank today's guests. Coming up for the rest of this week, we learn about the Thatcher Island Wildlife Refuge. Hayman Castle reopens. And we're going to also talk with Chris Griffins once again of the Gloucester Stage Company. We are due for a visit with that guy. It's been a while. So hope you enjoy the rest of your night, and we will see you first thing tomorrow.